How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Nun Daled, Daf 54 of Masechta Menachos. Friends, today we continue discussing the Mishnah that we learned, I believe it was yesterday, and we had seen a machlekes in the Mishnah yesterday about how the leavening agent, how the sourdough starter fits in to a korban minchah that needs to be chametz, for example, chametz or the chotei lechem. Where does the leavening agent come from? Rabbi Meir had said that it comes from the flour itself. So if you have any sorrow in a flour, you take some of the flour itself and you get that going with some leavening. You try to get that leavening quickly. Rabbi Yehuda says you could take some sourdough starter and add it to the isaron milichatchila. So we're going to discuss that machlokes, and that machlokes is then going to lead us, is going to guide us through the daf. Is going to be sort of the starting point of the rest of the daf. Along the way, we will discuss also adding water to a minchas chotei, which is an interesting idea, which we will get to. And then really the biggest chunk of today's daf will be when a shiur changes over time. So, just quickly, if you remember from yesterday, the machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda when it came to the sourdough starter was related to, part of the discussion was, well, what happens when the sourdough starter is more dense or more liquidy, and maybe there'll be too much or too little, and then that kind of gets into, well, what happens in scenarios where, I don't know, you have meat that's more than a kibeya, and then it becomes less than a kibeya, and then it grows again. Anyways, we'll get there. Oh, sheesh. Yeah, we will get there. It's a little bit technical, but it didn't feel so hard, but I'm not so convinced though. Anyways, so that's kind of like the vibe of the daf, kind of dealing with different shiurim of things that can be bigger, that can be smaller. Well, that's what we have in store for us on Daf Nun Daled. So far today, it's 8 a.m. We haven't had any sirens since, I don't know, some point yesterday afternoon or something, which is good. So hopefully we won't have any over the next hour or so. Friends, let's jump into Daf Nun Daled of Masechta Menachos. Friends, we begin on Daf Nun Gimel Amid Beis. About 6 or so lines from the bottom at the 2 dots. Let us, so I want to remind us of what this machlekes was between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. So let's say you have a korban toda. Now the korban toda is brought with 40 loaves of bread. As we know, 4 types of bread, 10 loaves of each type. One of those types of bread is actually chametz. Okay. Now, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember correctly, basically all of the breads of the lachmi toda, I think, are a total of 2 isarons. And I think the way that it works is that the 10 chametz breads are 1 isaron. Kilu, each one of the 10 chametz breads is a tenth of an isaron. And I believe that all of the remaining 30 breads are a total of 1 isaron. I.e., each loaf of the 30 matzah breads, right, non-leavened breads, are each like a 30th of an isaron. But there's going to be 1 isaron of flour that's going to be separated, and from that will be brought the 10 chametz breads. Now, those chametz breads need to be leavened somehow with like yeast or something like that. So where does that come from? So Reb Meir says that you use the flour itself in order to get some leavening going on. And if I understand what that means, so how do you make like I'm assuming that we're talking about like, let's see. How do you get a bread to rise? I'm totally the wrong person to be answering this, but I'll give it my best shot. I think the way that you get a bread to rise is either you put in yeast or you can use like a sourdough starter, I think. And I think what a sourdough starter is, I looked it up yesterday. I watched a YouTube video. So I know what I saw in the YouTube video, which is basically what you do is you take some, without getting into the details, I'm not teaching how to make a sourdough starter, but the concept is you take some flour and you take some water and you mix them together. and then you let it sit for 1 day. And after, I think 1 day is not really going to make much of a difference, then I think you maybe let it sit for another day. And then it starts to grow, it starts to expand, and starts to like have some kind of, fermentation and chemical reaction. It starts to grow a bit. And you got to like take some out of it, and then you got to, what's called feeding it. You put in some flour and some more water, and it's basically flour and water that over time kind of develops into like a fermentating, rising, leavening agent. Now the thing is that takes time. Right? I think like leaving it for like 1 day isn't really going to make much of a difference. You have to leave it for like a few days, and you kind of develop it over time. So I don't know. Reb Meir, I think is basically saying somehow you can make some kind of a quick starter. I don't know, in an afternoon or something. Anyways, Reb Yehuda says that's not really going to be much of a starter. What does Reb Yehuda say in the Mishnah? Reb Yehuda Omer, Afi einam min hamuvchar. That's not ideal. So Reb Yehuda says no. Take some sourdough starter and mix it in with the isaron. So what you'll do is you'll take your isaron measuring cup. And according to Babble, you'll start by taking some sourdough starter and putting it into the measuring cup. And then you'll fill up the rest of the isaron measuring cup with flour. And then you'll have 1 isaron of flour, and included in that isaron of flour is some sourdough starter. And you'll be able to just kind of knead them all and you'll make it all to one dough. And you'll have your starter in the dough. I don't know, is that how sourdough starter works? You take like some flour and some water, and you put in some of this, like, I think so, right? Why not? I don't know, unless I'm totally wrong. I'm imagining that you take some of your starter and you mix it together with the new dough. And then as long as you have some of that starter in there, making things happen, making some magic, so then it makes the thing rise. Did I get that correct? Sheesh. Well, if can anybody direct me over here? Am I getting this right? Am I getting this wrong? If I'm getting it wrong, can you tell us what's right? Anyways, so according to Babble, that's what you do. You take your isaron measuring cup, and you put in some sourdough starter. You fill up the rest of the measuring cup with flour, and that's that. Now, Reb Meir, however, had a problem with that. And his problem with that is that, look, the thing is, we need an isaron of flour. And if you're going to put in sourdough starter into the isaron, that's fine. But you would have to make sure that the amount of flour, because the sourdough starter is basically just flour and water, so the amount of flour in the starter that you're putting into the dough, into the isaron, there would have to be, so let's say the sourdough starter that you're putting into the isaron is going to take up, 10% of the measure. Now in isaron, if you remember from the longest stop, I think ever in Babylon Talmud history, an isaron is 43.2 eggs. So eggs worth. So a tenth of that is about 4.5 eggs worth. So you'll have, let's say 10% of the isaron is the sourdough starter. I don't know if that's too much, too little. So you're going to want to make, and now you're going to have 90% of the isaron is actual flour. You're going to want to make sure that in that 10% of starter, there is a tenth of a isaron's worth of flour in that starter. Now the thing is, if the starter is very dense, it's a very dense starter, so there might be more than a tenth of an isaron's worth of flour packed into there. And if it's if it's a more watery, more liquidy, looser starter, so there might be less than a tenth of an isaron in there. And therefore says Reb Meir that, to Reb Yehuda, that if you're going to be putting starter into the isaron, sometimes you're going to have too much flour if it's dense. Sometimes you can have too little flour if it's loose. And therefore, Reb Meir says, look, you gotta just, I guess, whip together some kind of a quick fermentation using the flour that you have in the isaron. Okay, that was the machlokes between Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda. Now we're going to look in the Gemara. Says the Gemara, "My chaser or my yiser." So this is basically what we were just discussing. When Reb Meir says to Reb Yehuda, because what does he say in the Mishnah? Amrulo, that basically Reb Meir responds to Reb Yehuda, "Api aisa chaser o yiser." That if you add the sourdough starter at the beginning, so you're going to have too much or too little flour. So if you just fill up the isaron with purely flour, and then you take from that flour to start a fermentation thing, so I know that you have a full isaron of flour. But if you start putting in sourdough starter, then you might have too much flour, too little flour. My chasero, you say, what does it mean too little flour, too much flour? Amr of Chizda says, of Chizda, isas asor ove, nimtzeis yisera midas ha'yisaron. Raka nimtzeis chasera midas chasera. So it says of Chizda, like I was just explaining a minute ago, that isas asor ove, that if the sourdough is a thick sourdough, well then, nimtzeis yisera midas ha'yisaron, then if it's a thick sourdough, it means that the flour content in the sourdough starter is more compact, that there's more flour in the sourdough, which means that you're going to have more flour than you would normally have if you just filled up the isaron purely with flour, because it's a dense sourdough starter. Raka, and if the starter is more liquidy, well then that means that there is a higher water content than flour content, and you might end up having nimtzeis chasera. You might end up having less flour in the isaron than you would if it was filled up entirely with flour. So sov ki kakayel isaron kakayel. So the Gemara asks, but who cares? At the end of the day, you're filling up your isaron, right? You take some sourdough starter, you put it into the isaron, and then you fill up the rest with flour. I don't care if the sourdough starter was a thick sourdough starter, or if it was a thin sourdough starter, or a liquidier one. At the end of the day, you put in some sourdough starter into the measuring cup, and you fill up the rest of it with flour. Done. Who cares? What are you getting so caught up with? Is it liquidy? Is it thick? Is it this? Is it that? Rav Yosef Damit Tavayu, Rabbi and Rav Yosef say, Likimos she'ein hoisa misha'arinon. Well, the thing is that we need to evaluate the isaron based on the initial state of the flour. I.e., we want to make sure that there's an isaron of flour in there, and when you're putting sourdough starter in the measuring cup, it complicates the cheshbon. Frag di Gemara, v'lishkol purta mine v'lichmetze me'avroi v'leise v'niloshe ba'adei. So the Gemara asks, okay, but how about this? According to Reb Meir, why don't you take some of the flour, right? So take the isaron measuring cup, fill it up with flour. Maybe take some of that flour, I don't know, maybe put it on a scale or something. I don't know, I guess maybe weigh how much it weighs. Take this flour and then mix it with another dough, right? If you're making some bread somewhere, so now you have another dough that is already, right, that's going to be chametz dough. That dough is already mixed with sourdough starter or whatever. That is a proper chametz dough. Take some of the flour from the isaron that you just measured, join it together with that other dough, include it in that other dough, so that this flour now starts leavening, and then take, I guess that's why I was saying measure it weigh it first. I don't know, maybe so then, I don't know, let's say it was like, 25 grams or something, I don't know, of dough, of flour. So maybe you're going to weigh like 25 grams of dough or something. And then you'll take it and put it back and then you'll put it with the rest of the flour. And that way you know that it's an isaron, right? Because you already measured an isaron. You're taking 10% of that isaron and you're mixing it together with some other dough. And then you're taking that same amount and putting it back in to the isaron. They're basically taking the same flour, at least the same amount of flour that you took out of the isaron. You're putting it back into the isaron while at a point that it's already been activated and leavened. And you'll mix it with the rest of the flour. And why don't you do it that way rather than just trying to start some kind of fermentation process very quickly with this flour that you just measured out? So the Gemara says, the thing is, if you allow that, then people will just notice like, oh wow, interesting, he's taking some activated bread, some activated dough, and he's just mixing it in with the isaron. They won't realize that it's essentially the same dough that was taken out that's just being returned after having been activated. People might not realize that, and they'll think, oh, you could just take, kind of like Rabbi Yehuda, you could just take some leavening agent and put it in, or even worse, even like after you already measured, right, maybe you have a fully sardana flour, and then they're going to take some sourdough starter and add it, and that's going to be a problem. People might not realize that you're just essentially adding back the same flour that you had in there before, just now that it's activated. And therefore, Reb Meir says, look, just take some of the flour, do a quick kind of fermentation. I don't even know how you would do a quick fermentation. Again, if anybody knows about these things, I probably could have researched it more, but anyways, if anybody's familiar with doing quick fermentations with flour, let us know. But anyways, that is the machlekes between Reb Meir and Rab Yehuda. Continues the Gemara. We don't make the shtei alechem and the chametz lachmei toda with apple cider or something. Let's go weiter. Mishum Reb Chanina ben Gamliel amu machmitzin. Reb Chanina ben Gamliel says you can use apples. Reb Kahana masni lo Reb Chanina ben Trajan. Oh, Reb Kahana says that it wasn't Reb Chanina ben Gamliel, rather it was Reb Chanina ben Trajan, one of the Sourdough Malchus, father-in-law of Reb Meir, the father of Bruria. Kiman azad d'tanan. Like whom does the following Mishnah from Masechta Trumas go like? Tapuach, that if you have an apple that is truma, sherisko, and then you crush the apple, the truma apple. V'nosno b'socha isa, and you take this crushed truma apple and you mix it together with a chulin dough. V'chimsa, and the apple, well, I guess the apple can serve as some kind of a fermentation thingy, I guess. Catalyst, maybe it's called. I guess you maybe would have to leave it out. So I don't know if you just take a crushed apple and just put it in there. Will it fermentate? I don't know. Seems like somehow it can. So then it will be truma. So if you take an apple and you crush it up and you mix it together with some chulin, I don't know, I guess flour or dough, whatever. So then it will, if it leavens the bread, so it will be considered truma. So come on, who is this like? Lema Reb Chanina ben Gamliel v'lo Rabbanan. So let's say that it's like Reb Chanina ben Gamliel, right? Who had said that you can use apples as a fermentation catalyst when it comes to minchas, when it comes to shtei alechem, when it comes to the chametz lachmei toda. So says the Gemara, afilu teim Rabbanan. You can even say the rabbis who said that you can't use the apples for the menachos. Nihi de chametz gomer lo have nuksha mia have. So, well, you could say that according to the rabbis, look, maybe it's not going to make proper chametz, and therefore, when it comes to the shtei alechem, when it comes to the chametz lachmei toda, which we want to be proper chametz, so they're saying don't use apples because it's not going to make a real geshmak chametz. However, would they say that if an apple of truma gets mixed together with chulin and it ferments, if it leavens the bread, what would they say there? They would say, yeah, you have to treat it like truma, because even if it's not proper chametz, not the milchatchila chametz, but they would call it chametz nuksha, some kind of a lighter kind of a, as Rashi says, ra'ua, kind of a shakier kind of a chametz. It does something to it. It's not ideal, but it does something enough that we would treat this dough as truma. Okay, givaldik. So now that we have discussed the sourdough starter and how sometimes there may be too much flour in there, sometimes there may be too little flour in there. So we now discuss briefly the minchas chotei, which is going to be interesting because the minchas chotei is flour, right? There's no oil in the minchas chotei. So what does that mean? So it's just plain flour, right? That the minchas chotei, there's no flour, there's no levona. I'm sorry, there is flour. There's no oil, there's no levona. It's just dry flour, right? So it's actually machlekes. Omer Reb Ila, says Reb Ila, Ein lecha hakosher lekmitza yoser minchas chotei. It says Reb Ila that the most difficult, right? They say that kmitza is one of the most difficult things the most difficult avodas in the Beis Hamikdash to do. Says Reb Ila that the most difficult chametz is the chametz of the minchas chotei. How come? Because it's just dry flour. And for a chametz, you need to get the perfect amount of flour. It's in between your 3 middle fingers, right? Excluding your pinky, excluding your thumb. You basically fill your palm. I think we learned about this earlier in the Masechta. You fill your palm with flour. And then what you do is you take your pinky and your thumb in order to make sure, right? In order to kind of make sure that there's no flour sticking out at the top of the bottom. But what happens is that because it's just dry flour, there's nothing binding it together. When you try to use your pinky and your thumb to even out the chametz, what ends up happening is too much fall, because you like take out some and like a whole bunch of flour falls out. And it's really difficult to remove what needs to be removed while keeping what needs to be kept, because there's nothing binding the flour together. It's just dry flour. So again, Reb Ila says, the most difficult chametz is the minchas chotei chametz. I thought that my understanding is what made the chametz so difficult was that you would have it for like minchas machvases and marcheshes, where like they were, or my fisoners, where they're already fried or baked, and then they were broken up into pieces, and then you take the fistful, and then you have these pieces, and there are pieces sticking out. You have to use your pinky and your thumb to start breaking up the pieces into perfect sizes. Anyways, okay, but here it says Reb Ila that he's saying that the most difficult was the flour, because since it was just dry flour, too much would come out, and it was very difficult to get the right amount. Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi Omar says, Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi minchas chotei megablo ba'moyim v'kshera. However, says Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi that, one second, minchas chotei has no oil. Minchas chotei has no frankincense. Nobody said anything about water. Says Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi, take some water, mix it together with the flour, and now it will stick together. It'll bind it, and it'll make it much easier to get the proper chametz without more than you want falling out. Let's say that the machlokes is the following: that Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi says that we measure the flour or in the chametz as it is right now, and therefore if you've added some water to the flour, so the chametz will be a chametz of flour and water. It doesn't have to necessarily be the perfect amount of flour. It has to be the perfect amount of whatever is in your hand. And so long as this mixture of flour and water is in your hand, and it's between your 3 middle fingers and there's nothing sticking out, that's fine. I'm not going to start geeking out about how much flour is there exactly. My sover, whereas Reb Ila holds lichmos shehayu misha arinon, whereas Reb Ila holds no, we go based on the original amount, that there has to be the same amount of flour in the chametz, whether there was no water in there or whether there is water in there. The same amount of flour has to be there. And therefore, we get into a similar situation with the sourdough starter, that if you take the minchas chotei, which is flour, and you mix it together with water, and then you take a chametz, well, if it's a very dense mixture of flour and water, well, then you might have too much flour in the chametz. If it's a looser mixture of flour and water, you might have too little flour in the chametz. And therefore, Reb Ila says that you can't be mixing the flour with water. You have to take the chametz of just flour, and then it gets very difficult in order to get it to be the perfect amount without flour just kind of falling out of it. So says the Gemara, no, even Reb Ila agrees, everybody agrees that we'll measure it based on how it is right now. However, right, so we're not going to geek out about how much flour there is exactly. However, this is machlokes the Marsover, my chareva mishemen, that Reb Yitzchak says that when the pasuk says that a minchas chotei is chareva, it's dry. It means it's dry in that there's no oil in it. All the other menachos have oil. This one doesn't have oil, but it can have water. Nobody said anything about water. It's just no oil. Whereas Whereas Reb Ila says that it needs to be mamish dry, nothing in it at all, and therefore Reb Ila says that there can't be any, right, tzcharev, it has to be mamish dry flour, that is the minchas chotei, dry flour, and therefore it becomes very difficult to make a chametz. Whereas Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi says dry means that there can't be any oil in it. You could put in flour, that's not a problem, and you can take the chametz that way, and that'll make it easier to separate a chametz from the minchas chotei. Friends, and now we discuss when a shiur changes over time, which has kind of been like the theme-ish that we've been discussing, right? The sourdough, sometimes it's more flour, sometimes it's less. The minchas chotei, maybe it could be more flour or less if you add water. So we're going to kind of see some similar angles to this question. Says the Gemara, Tanan Osam, we learn in a Mishnah in Masechta Uktzin, the last Masechta in Seder Tyrus. It says there, B'sara egel she nitpach u'b'sar zikena she nismayich. Okay, so the meat of a calf, of a young cow that expanded. So I was looking at the explanation of the Kahati Mishnayos, and it said, I think when cooking it, the meat of a calf, of I guess veal or something, would expand, and if it's an older animal, it would contract. I don't know. Here Rashi doesn't say anything about cooking. There seems to be some assumption. Maybe people know about this. I don't know. I'm not such of a baker or a cooker, or so. If we have bakers and cookers, so and anybody who's familiar with these sugyas, maybe if you know about that, does veal expand when you cook it? Does old cow meat contract? I don't know. Maybe even goat meat. Anyways, so the assumption is, for whatever it is, that we're talking about calf meat, that the calf meat expands and old meat contracts. Older animal meat, like animals that are older, their meat contracts. Okay, now, Tananosam, we learned in a Mishnah in Uktzin, B'sara egel, the flesh of a calf, shenitpach, that expanded. So initially it was less than a kibeya, and it expanded so that now it is more than a kibeya. And the question is about tumas ochlin. You see, when it comes to tumas ochlin, as we already know from Masechta Shabbos, Daf, I don't know, Lamed Vav or something, that tumas ochlin can, right, if food becomes tameh, it can be metame. Depending on if it's like a rishon or a tumah, let's say it's a sheni the tumah, it can be posel truma, let's say, but it can only pass on the tumah if it is a kibeya, if it is the size of a kibeya or more. If the food that is tameh is the size of a kibeya, so it can be mitame, it can pass on tumah, transmit tumah, maybe is a more better word. So if you have this calf meat that initially was less than a beya, but it expanded, and now it's more than a beya. Uvisar zikena, or the meat of an older animal, shenismaich, that shrunk, and it was initially a kibeya, but now it is less than a kibeya, so it no longer has the proper shiur. Mishtar in the k'moshein, so we evaluate it as it is. The question is, what does it mean that we evaluate it as it is? Rab Chia Reb Yochanan Amrei. So Rab Chia and Reb Yochanan. I'm going to refer to this as Reb Yochanan. So Reb Yochanan says, Mishtarin kimos shehein. We evaluate them as they are now. So therefore, the calf meat is now a kibeya. We evaluate it as a kibeya, and it can be mitame. The old meat, I'm going to call it old meat. The old cow meat. What's the difference? The meat from the old one. The meat from the old meat. The old meat is now less than a kibeya, so it's not mitame. We go based on it. We what's the word? We go with the flow. We live in the moment. Very inspirational Gemara. So therefore, the calf meat is mitame, the old meat is not mitame. Now, Shmuel of Reb Shimon Birebi v'Rish Lakish, I'm going to refer to this as Rish Lakish. I'm a mishtarin the kmos. Okay, this is a little bit confusing because it says the kmos shehein, which is literally what it said for Rabbi Yochanan as well. But the Gosabach changed it to kmos shehayu. But like literally throughout the daf, whenever it should say kmos shehayu, it basically refers to both of them living in the moment and living in the past as kmos shehein, which is a little bit confusing. Sometimes it's corrected, sometimes it isn't. So I have to remember to correct it in the right places. Anyways, so it says Rish Lakish that it goes likmos shehayu, as it was initially. And therefore, the calf meat, I guess that means that the calf meat is not a kibeya, and the old meat is a kibeya. We go based on the initial state. Okay. Meisvei, we have, however, a question from a brisa. Besara egel shelohaya bo kishiur. Okay, so if you have calf meat that initially was less than a kibeya, vitafach ve'omad al kishir, and now it expanded, and it is a kibeya. So you have calf meat that was initially less than a kibeya, and now it's more than a kibeya. So initially, when it was less than a kibeya, it was tahor. It was not mitame. And now that it is a kibeya, it's mitame. So we see that we live in the moment. We see that we live in the moment, like Rabbi Yochanan. Live in the moment, unlike Rish Lakish. Answers Rish Lakish midrabanan. Rish Lakish will say, no, when we say that the calf meat that is now a kibeya is mitame, it's mitame midrabanan, sure. Midrabanan we say it's mitame as a stringency. But midaraisa, since initially it was less than a kibeya, it's not mitame midaraisa. Midrabanan, sure. If we're talking about midarabanan, ema seifa, but the brisa continues. V'chein bepigel, v'chein benoser. And similar with pigel and noser, and what we assume that what that means is that if there was machshavas chutz lezmano, or if it was left past the time that you're allowed to eat it, and it was less than a size of a kibeya, or since pigel and noser we're talking about a kazayis, so it was less than a kazayis, but then it expanded and now it's more than a kazayis. If you eat it, you'll be chayiv karis for pigel, you'll be chayiv karis for noser. Now, Yomer b'shlama d'oraisa hanudika pigel v'noser. So if we're talking about that now that it's a shiur, so then we treat it as a proper shiur. So I understand how this could be. You could be chayiv karis for pigel. You could be chayiv karis for noser. Midoraisa. It's now a kazayis. It wasn't before, but it expanded. Now it's a kazayis. You can be chayiv for pigel. Chayiv karis. You can be chayiv karis for noser. I get it. Eli Omer d'Rabbanan. But if you're saying that no, you're only chayiv midorabanan. Who's ever heard of karis midorabanan? No karis midorabanan. Pigel v'noser midorabanan miika. Is there a chiyuv karis for pigel and noser midorabanan? No way, no how. No way, no how. So Rish Lakish, how are you going to explain this? So ema v'chein betumas pigel v'chein betumas noser. Rish Lakish is a very creative answer. Rish Lakish says there's a Mishnah at the end of Arvei Psachim that says that pigel and noser are metame asayadayim midirabanan. That the Chacham said that when it comes to pigel, when it comes to noser, if you touch it, you're gonna have to go to the mikveh. If you touch it, you're gonna have to go to the mikveh. I think it was what it means. They have to go to the mikveh. Either you have to go to the mikveh, or you have to purify yourself somehow. I assume it means you have to go to the mikveh. But your hands are tummy. So that's midrabanan. So what Rish Lakish is saying is, what does it mean that you're chayiv for that if you have the calf meat that was less than a kazayis now becomes more than a kazayis, you're going to be chayiv? It doesn't mean that you're going to be chayiv karis for pigel. No, it means that there will be tumas, right? That will be mitame yadayim, right? Betumas pigel, v'tumas noser. That the tumah d'Rabbanon of pigel, the tumah d'Rabbanon of noser will apply to this meat that expanded and is more than a kazayis now. But it's all d'Rabbanon. Because after all, I may have thought, v'tumas pigel, v'tumas noser d'Rabbanon I may have thought that since anyways, the tumah of pigul, the tumah of noser, the fact that if you touch it, it's mitami or yadayim, is only midrabanan to begin with, maybe we would have thought that the Chacham didn't go so far as to say that this calf meat that was initially less than a kazayis, now it expanded, now it's more than a kazayis, that's also mitami yadayim. Maybe they would say in that case it's not mitami yadayim. Kuliyai b'drabanan lo avud rabbanon. The rabbis didn't extend the mitami yadayim halacha to calf meat that expanded over time. Kamaj Milan, that they did expand their din derabanan of tuma seyadayim for pigul and for nosar, even for calf's meat that was initially less than a kazayis that expanded to be more than a kazayis. But Rish Lakish maintains that mida oraisa we stick to the initial state, and when you have less than a shiur and it expands to be more than a shiur, it will only be considered a proper shiur mida rabbanan. Tashma coming here. Besides the kena, if you have the flesh of an older animal, that initially had a shiur, but then it shrunk to be less than a shiur, so initially when it was a kibeya, so it was mitame, but now that it's less than a kibeya, it's tahor, it's not mitame anymore. So how is Rish Lakish going to answer for that? We're saying that it shrunk and now it's no longer mitame. Rish Lakish would say it goes based on the initial shiur, which is a kibeya. Of course it should be mitame according to Rish Lakish. How does he explain this brisa that's saying that it's not mitame? So Omar Rabbah, so says Rabbah, here's the dilio. Kolecha d'mei kara hava bei v'hashta leis bei ha'leis bei. V'cholecha d'mei kara lo hava bei v'hashta hava bei midrabon. Says Rabbah, look, here is the dilio. Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish both agree in the following two scenarios. Scenario number one, when it was initially a kibeya, and now it's less than a kibeya. Wait, was that the first one? Yes, right? If initially there was a kibeya, there was a proper shiur, and now there isn't a proper shiur, everyone agrees there's no proper shiur right now. And that's what this brisa was saying. Right? This brisa was saying that if you have this old meat and it had a kibeya, but now it's less than a kibeya, so then it's tahor. Rish Lakish would agree. If it initially had a shiur and now it doesn't have a shiur, everyone agrees there's no shiur. They also agree that if initially there was no shiur and now there is a shiur, so it will be treated as a proper shiur midrabanan. Everyone agrees on that as well. Where they argue is kigon shahaya bo kishir v'tzamak v'chazav v'tafach. Where they argue is when initially there was a shiur, but then there wasn't a shiur, but then the shiur came back again. Okay, so if you have, let's say, old meat, or let's say calf's meat. Okay, so you have calf's meat and it was initially a kibeya, but then it shrunk to be less than a kibeya, but then it became a kibeya again. So there, Rabbi Yochanan says that, okay, well, I mean, Rabba had said a minute ago that if that calf meat started out as a kibeya and then became less than a kibeya, and now it's less than a kibeya, Rabba had just said everyone would agree it's less than a kibeya. However, the question is, what if it now expands once again and it's once again a kibeya? So Rabbi Yochanan would say, okay, well, it's a kibeya now, it has a shiur. Rish Lakish would disagree and says, well, when it became less than a kibeya and there was no shiur, and we're saying that it was tahor at that point, that's it, it's nidche. It's not going to ever become tamei again, even if it expands again. That's the difference. That's what they argue. The Rabbi Yochanan says that if it was a shiur and then it was less than a shiur, but it returned to being a shiur, we'll treat it as a proper shiur. Whereas Rish Lakish says that once it loses its shiur, it's lost forever. It's nidche. Where there was a proper amount, but there was a kebeya, let's say by Tumas Ochlin, v'tzomach, and then it shrunk to be less than a kebeya, but then it expanded once again, and now it is a kebeya, it's a proper shiur. So Demar Savar Yesh Dichui Be'isura, that Rish Lakish says it's nidche. That once it lost the shiur forever. and it can no longer be metame. Umaysover ein dichui be'isure, whereas Rabbi Yochanan says, no, there's no concept of nidche. And sure, while it was less than a shiur, it was less than a shiur, it wasn't metame, but when it returned to being a kebeya, a proper shiur, it once again is metame, and ein dichui be'isura, there's no concept of it being pushed off forever, of kind of losing its ability to be metame forever. If it expands again, it'll be metame once again. Is there really such an opinion? That is the opinion that we're saying belongs to Rish Lakish. Is that actually a viable opinion that exists? That there's nidche by Yisurin? That when you have a kebeya and it becomes less than a kebeya, it'll be tahor forever? Even if it expands again, it will still be tahor? It's nidche? Is that really a viable opinion? But we learn in the Mishnah, in Tyrus, the Mishnah in Tyrus says, Kabeya ochlin, that if you have a kebeya of ochlin, sheinicha b'chama, that was left out in the sun, v'nismatu, and it shrunk in the heat of the sun. V'chein, similarly, kazayis min ameis, a kazayis of flesh from a mace, which I assume the point is that it's mitami ba'oil, kazayis min anavela, v'chadosha min asheretz, v'chazayis pigo, v'chazayis nosu, v'chazayis chelev, tehorin. Also in those situations, if they were left out in the sun and they shrunk to be less than the proper shiur, whether that shiur is a kebeya or a kazayis or a kadosha, whatever it is, whatever their respective shiur is, it's less than that. So then it will be considered less than a shiur. Ve'en chayven Allah alein mishum pigo v'noser v'chelev. Okay, you won't be chayiv if it's less than a kazayis when it comes to pigo or noser or chelev. You won't be chayiv if it's shrunk to be less than a shiur. Hinichon b'gishamim. But if you left them out there and then it started raining, v'tafchu, and they expanded once again, Timein, well then they will return to their original status, whether that's for tumah, whether that's for pigul, noser, chelev, whatever their sort of chumrah, whatever their isser was, it returns. We don't say that there's dichui. So tiyufta l'mandamer yesh dichui be'isurin tiyufta. So that would be a very, very serious question for Rish Lakish, who we're saying says that there is dichui by isurin, because over here we're saying once it expanded again, well then its isur returns. Tashmakam, and here. Tormin tainim al hagrogris biminyin. Okay, tainim are fresh figs. I'm going to drink a little bit of water. Tainim are fresh figs. Grogris are dried figs. Now let's just say, obviously every fig is different. Every fresh fig is unique, and every dried fig is unique. But to make things easy, let's say that a fresh fig, a good plump geschmacke fresh fig, has twice the volume of a dry fig. As tasty as the dried figs might be, they are dried and withered and smaller. All their water content has been kind of evaporated, at least to a large extent. So fresh figs are like twice the volume of dried figs. We'll use that kind of as our guide for this sugya. So we're saying here that if you have 100 figs, 90 of them are dried, 10 of them are fresh. So we're assuming for now that we're talking about meiser rather than truma. So you have to separate 10%. So the question is, there's two ways we can go about this. We can go based on count, based on number. We have 100 figs. 10 of them are meiser. So you have 90 dried ones, 10 fresh ones. Take the 10 fresh ones. That's your meiser. 10 out of 100, 10%. Another way of looking at it, though, is that, well, the fresh figs have twice the volume of the dried figs, so you're actually giving twice as much meiser as you need to be giving. And while that sounds really nice and gracious, it is not without trickiness. How come? Well, because this is the way I understand it. I didn't see anybody spell it out exactly this way. But basically, when it comes to normally trumas and meisters, so you have, let's say, 100 crops. So I did the math, actually. Technically, if you have 100 crops, so truma generally there's no official amount of truma, as we're actually going to see a little bit later. There's no official amount of truma, but it's generally considered to be a 50th, 2%. So you have, let's say, 100 figs, okay? 2 of them, you separate those at truma. Now, of the 98 that remain, you take 10% of that, and then, okay, you give that to the Levi. And now 88.2 figs remain. And then you take, and the 88.2 figs, they're still tevel. You've already separated truma, you've already separated ma'aser rishon. But the 88.2 figs that remain are still tevel, because you still have to separate ma'aser sheni, or ma'aser ani, depending on the year of the Shemitah cycle. And then once you separate 10% of what's left, and you have, I think, 79.34 figs left, after you separate all of that, now you're, let's call it 73.5 or so percent of, or your 79.5 or so figs are now chulin, and you can eat them. So now, interestingly, what happens if you separate truma, great, and then you separate twice the amount of ma'aser that you need to separate. So instead of separating roughly 10 figs as ma'aser rishon, you separate roughly 20 figs as ma'aser rishon, twice as much as you needed to. So what happens is the remaining figs, right? So if, let's say, you separated 2 already as truma, and then you separate another 20, so you separated 22 figs already, that's plenty. All you had to separate was really like 20.5 figs or something. So you separated 2 figs already, and then you separate another 20 for ma'aser. So the remaining 78 figs are chulin. That's it. You don't need to separate more from them. Yeah, you've already separated enough. Those 78 are chulin. But the 20 figs that you separated as ma'aser, so 10 of them are ma'aser, but the other half of them, that's still tevel. Because, right, from that needs to be then separated, ma'aser sheni or whatever. So half of it will be the ma'aser, but the other half will be tevel. So while it sounds great to say, wow, you separated so much as ma'aser, wow, you separated twice as much ma'aser as you needed to, it's very nice, but it's also a little bit tricky, because half of that is ma'aser, half of it is tevel. Because you're still going to have to, right, half of it is going to be for ma'aser sheni or ma'aser ani, and until that is separated, so then it's that's still going to be tevel, so you have to be careful with that. So now back to our scenario, where you have 100 figs, 90 of them are dried, and 10% of them are, 90 of the 100 are dried, and 10 of them are fresh. So if we go based on number, so you take 10 fresh figs, and you separate them as ma'aser, so you separated 10 out of 100, so great, that's ma'aser. But if you go based on volume, you actually separated twice as much ma'aser as you needed to, which becomes tricky, because that means that half of those, right, 5 of those figs, or whatever, half of them are tevel. So you have to be careful there. So now, Tashma coming here, Tormin Tainim ala Grogris b'minyan. So if we have 100 figs, 90 of them are dried figs, 10 of them are fresh figs. So we're saying, Tormin Tainim, you could separate the 10 fresh figs as, even though it says truma, we're assuming now it means ma'aser. You could separate those fresh figs as ma'aser, ala Grogris, right? And in order, right, on behalf of the dried figs, and right, so you have all these figs, and you say you can leave the dried figs there, separate the 10 fresh figs as your ma'aser. The minyan, kilu, based on their number, 10 out of 100, not based on volume. Now, Iyamar bishlama likmos shehayu mishayrin shapir. It says shehain, but again, you have to switch around the words. You have to, every time it says shehain, you have to ask yourself, is it really shehain or is it shayu? Here it's shayu. So if it goes like Rish Lakish, taka, we're good. Because those dried figs were not initially dried, they were initially fresh. So if you say like Rish Lakish that we go based on the initial amount, so all of those 90 dried figs were initially fresh, geschmacke, plumpe figs, just like the 10 that were separated. in which case I understand why we can go by number. We're basically treating it as if we had 100 fresh figs, and you're taking 10 fresh figs, so it's not just number, it's also volume, right? Because we're considering them as if they're all fresh, and you're separating 10%, both in number and, practically speaking, in volume. Again, if we assume that we're treating them all as if they're fresh, based on their initial state. But if you say like Rabbi Yochanan, that we go with the flow, that we live in the moment, and that right now there are 90 dried figs, and right now there are 10 fresh figs, well then you're separating twice as much meiser as you need. So havale marbe b'meisers, you're separating too much meiser. V'atanya marbe b'meisers, when it comes to separating too much meiser, Peirosav misukanim, so the 90 figs would be chulin at this point, because you've already separated more than enough. Right? You separated truma, you separated twice as much meiser as you need to, you're done. The rest is chulin. All the 90 figs, the dried figs, are going to be chulin. But the 10 fresh figs that you separated are problematic, because half of it is tevel. When you separate too much meiser, then there's going to be tevel in there. So if you go based on Rabbi Yochanan, that we're going based on how everything is now, well, right now the dried figs are dried figs and the fresh figs are fresh figs, which means that they have twice the volume of the dried figs. You're separating, when you separate 10 fresh figs, you're separating twice as much meiser as you need. There's going to be tevel in there. So elamai lichmos shehayu. So what you're gonna? So you want to say like Rish Lakish? Go based on how they were before, that we're treating them all, that they're nice, plump, geschmack figs. But Ema Seifa, if we go weiter in the Brisa, it says, Grogris alatenim b'mida. That if you have 90 fresh figs and 10 dried figs, so in that case, we don't go based on number. We don't say, just separate 10 dried figs and it will work for the 90 fresh figs. There we say go based on volume. And since the dried figs are half the volume, you're going to have to separate 20 dried figs. Now, Iyam Bishlama Kimos Shehain, so here it makes sense to say like Rabbi Yochanan, that we are going based on how things are in the moment. Which is, in the moment, there are 90 fresh figs, 10 dried figs, and therefore the dried figs have half the volume, therefore we have to double it. Shapir, Givaldig, Eliomar, D'chmos Shein. But if you say that we go K'mos Shahayu, if we go based on their initial state, well then you should just be separating 10 of the dried figs, because we're going to treat them as if they're fresh figs. And if we're separating now based on volume and saying separate 20, you're going to be separating twice as much and you get into the same bind. So therefore in the Seifa it makes sense to say like Rabbi Yochanan, live in the moment, and right now the dried figs are dried, therefore you have to double them in order to get the proper volume. So the ratio seems to be saying, so if, based on how we're trying to approach this sugya, the ratio seems to be telling us that we go based like Rish Lakish, based on their initial state, but the Seifa is saying, like Rabbi Yochanan, that we go based on how things are right now. So elacha b'truma gedola askinan. So rather, we're not talking about meiser here. We're talking about truma gedola. We're talking about separating truma gedola. That when it comes to separating truma gedola, so when it comes to separating truma gedola, technically mida oraisa, truma gedola could be any amount. Mida oraisa truma gedola could be any amount, even the smallest amount. However, the Chachamim said that if you're kind of stingy, you'll give 1/60th. If you're very generous, you'll give 1/40th, and the average though is 1/50th. So we kind of we do more than we technically need to, and therefore v'reisha b'ayin yofeh, v'sefer b'ayin yofeh. There's different ways we're going to end up rejecting this, but anyways, you can say that the way I kind of understood this was, you could say in the Reisha b'ayin yafeh, meaning that you could say that the Reisha is talking about we go based on how things are initially, and we're giving the, I guess, number, right? If we go based on how things were initially, so then you're giving kind of 10, which is kind of, I guess, more, right? If you go based on how things are right now, no, if we go based on how I guess you can go based on how things are right now. No, in the ratio, if you go based on how things are right now, so 90 of them are dried, and still you're giving 10 plump ones, which is more than you need to, if you do it from that extent, right, that you're kind of giving more than you need to. And in the Seifa, right, I guess if we say that we go based on how things are initially, where these dried ones, right, we're saying give 20 dried ones, where you're giving kind of more than you need to. Okay. V'reisha b'ayin yafeh, v'seifa b'ayin yafeh. Okay, in both cases you're kind of giving generously. Okay, yeah. Again, it's a little bit tricky to understand how to understand this literally, but yeah, I guess if you say, the way I kind of wanted to understand it was that if you view the ratio as I said, if you view the ratio as being how things are now, well then by separating 10 fresh ones, you're separating more than you need to. If you, the Seifa could be talking about how things were initially, in which case the 10 dried ones were initially plump and still you're giving 20. I don't know. If this is the case, Ema Seifa. But anyways, the Gemara rejects this because the Brisa continues and says, Amr Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yossi, says Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yossi, Abba, that my father Rabbi Yossi, Hayonotel Eser Grogris Sheb Mikzoa Al Tishim Sheb Kalkala, that his father Rabbi Yossi would separate 10 dried figs and out of 90 fresh figs. That there were 100 figs, 90 of them were fresh, 10 of them were dried, and that is what he would separate for Meiser. V'betruma Gedola Eser Mayavite. And if we're talking about Truma Gedola, so then why are we explicitly talking about 10? Why are we explicitly talking about Rabbi Yossi separating 10? I mean, this is Truma Gedola. So Ela Hacha Betrumas Meiser Askinan. Okay. Rather, actually what we're talking about here is Trumas Meiser. Okay. So basically when the Levi receives is Truma, so then from that Truma he separates 10% of that and he gives that to the Kohen. So Abba Elazar ben Gomel, and it's Abba Elazar ben Gomel, the Tanya that we learned in the Brisa, Abba Elazar ben Gomel Omer, v'nechshav lochem trumaschem, that this pasuk is in the context of Trumas Meiser, and it says, v'nechshav lochem trumaschem, kidagon min agoren v'chamlev min ayekeb. Okay, that this Trumas Meiser it says v'nechshav lochem trumaschem, will be considered. What does that mean? So Trumaschem is plural, but shtei Trumas hakozim medaber. We're talking about two Trumas here. Echad Truma Gedola v'echad Trumas Meiser. That we're comparing Truma Gedola, two Trumas, Truma Gedola and Trumas Meiser. Both of them are treated as Truma, right? Trumas Meiser has the same dinim as Truma. It's given to the Kohen. Only a Kohen can eat it, etc. All the same halachas as Truma. And we're comparing the two. Kishem Truma Gedola niteles be'omed uvemachshava. Just like Truma Gedola doesn't have to be an exact amount. You could say, okay, this is around 2%. And also, even machshava, right? As Rashi says, you could kind of look at this side of what you're eating and say, okay, that's what I'm going to separate, and then eat from the other side, even machshava. So kach trumas meiser, he tells ba'omed of machshava. So also trumas meiser can just be kind of evaluated and also b'machshava. Ma truma gedola, just like truma gedola, ba'ayin yafeh, you are kind of more generous than you need to when it comes to Truma Gedola. Av Trumas Meiser ba'ayin yafeh. So also Trumas Meiser, you're going to give, I guess, be gracious. Umina, and similarly, and from Trumas Meiser, Omar Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yossi Abba Shol wait, what? Omar Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yossi Abba Yanotel Eser Grogris, that my father would take 10 dried figs, Sheb Mikzoa Al Tishim Sheb Kalkala, that there would be 100 figs, 90 of them were fresh, 10 of them were dried, and he would separate those. Now, Iyamad Bishlama Likmos Shehayu Aminan Shaper. So if we say that it goes based on how the initial state, well, those 10 dried figs were initially fresh figs, just like the other 90. So I can understand why you would separate Trumas Meiser from those dried figs, since we go based on their initial state where they were fresh, just like the other 90. Eli Omar Kimos She'ein But if you say based on how they are now, well, the dried figs are dried. Batzelu, they are less than meiser. Because Rav Dimi, Amar Belazar, when Rav Dimi came and says the name Rav Belazar, shiny grogers. No, it's different when it comes to dried figs. Ho v'yachal l'shalkon, because you can boil them. Lachzir l'kmosheim, and make them back to how they were before. You can re-plump them. And therefore, because you can re-plump them, so even dried figs, even if you go based on how they are now, like Rabbi Yochanan, you can still consider them, you could still separate 10 dried figs, right? If you have 100 figs, 90 are fresh, 10 are dried, you could still separate those as Trumas Meiser, since you could technically boil them and plump them up. Okay, so in the end, that wasn't necessarily a raya either way. We wanted to say that maybe it makes more sense like Rish Lakish, but we ended up explaining it like Rabbi Yochanan as well. However, I do think that based on that initial brisa that we had at the bottom of Nindalad Amud Aleph, I still think that would be tricky for Rish Lakish, right? That brisa that had said that besides the Kena Shaya Bo Kshir V'Tzamak Pachas Mikashir Tami L'Sha'avar V'Tar Mikan L'Haba. That one, I think you're going to have to say, is going to be tricky for Rish Lakish, because that seems going based on what it is now. Since right now it's less than a shiur, so then it is tahor going forward. Well, friends, on Daf Nun Daled, Daf 54 of Masechta Menachos, we learned about adding leavening agent to a chametz minchah. That was interesting. We got deeper into the machlekes in the Mishnah between Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda, and why Reb Meir felt that the leavening had to come from the flour itself, and you couldn't add sourdough to the isaron because there might be too much flour if it's compact, or if it's too loose, there might be too little flour, etc. And then that led us also to a discussion about adding water to a minchas chotei. Of course, a minchas chotei, there's no oil in it, nor is there any levona. It's very plain. But the question is, can you add water to it? That would help with the chametz. So Reb Illa said that the minchas chotei chametz was the trickiest chametz that there was, because since the flour was dry, often some of it would fall out, and it was very difficult to get just the right amount because there was nothing binding it together. Whereas Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi, I believe, says that you can add water to it, which would bind it together better, and it would make it easier to separate the chametz, because all we're saying is that it needs to be dry to the extent that there can't be any oil in it, but you could add water to it. And then we had a discussion about when a shiur changes over time. So do you go based on the initial state, or do you go based on the new state? Rabbi Yochanan says you go based on the new shiur, you go based on the new state, on how it is now, whereas Rish Lakish says it goes based on the initial shiur, on what it was initially. We had Rabbah in the middle. He wanted to maybe say that maybe the dafka only argue when kind of it was one way, then changed and came back. But I mean, that ended up being kind of tricky for Rish Lakish. And then moving forward, we didn't necessarily assume that way. I don't think. I think as I mentioned at the end of the daf, I think though that the question that we asked from the Bryce on daf Nun Daled Amud Aleph may, however, be difficult for. I don't know if we really were able to resolve that one. So maybe Rabbi Yochanan was a stronger shita. Friends, that was daf Nun Daled of Masechta Menachos. Hope you enjoyed. Cheers.